Hi, I'm Alan Miller, co-founder of the Together Declaration, and I'm really pleased today that I'm lucky enough to be speaking to Nick Corbishley, who, Nick, as many of you will know, is the author of this new book that's come out called Scanned, that's looking at digital identity, vaccine passports, mandates, and all the things that have led up to the question of digital ID over the last period in a very comprehensive way. It's a really good read. So we're very lucky that Nick's with us here today. Just a little bit about Nick. Nick's obviously an author, but he's a teacher as well. He speaks 3 languages, and he spent a lot of time working with news outlets such as Wall Street, and also for the blog Naked Capitalism. Thanks for being with us today, Nick.
Thanks for having me, Alan. It's a pleasure.
Everything's happened so fast in the last couple of years, but maybe not for the trained eye if you've been looking at it before, like you begin to talk about in your book. In Britain, or recently, we've seen the end of vaccine passports domestically, and the mandate has been pushed away and they did a U-turn on it. But the question of digital ID is still very big for everyone. Set the tone, like you did in the book, about the relationship between vaccine passports and digital ID, and why you think there's such a strong relationship between the two.
Vaccine passports served a fundamental purpose in the creation and the propagation of digital identity systems. They did so, I think, because they provided the governments with the opportunity, the possibility of setting up digital identity infrastructure, which has happened in dozens of countries around the world. So they afforded the possibility to do that. They also played a very important role in collective psychology, in my mind. They provided, they allowed governments to condition the general public to the idea of using their mobile phone as a means of entry, as an entry point into many, many different locations, venues, and as a form of access to basic services and basic amenities. I mean, one of the things that probably scared me the most about the last 8 to 9 months in Europe is how readily most people accepted this and just kind of like went along with it. I mean, like there was pushback in different countries. So, I mean, like you saw more pushback, I think, in Germany, you saw more pushback in Austria, you saw more pushback in Italy. But where I live in Spain, we had vaccine passports like the UK for a very brief period. It was about 1.5 months, 2 months from December 2021. I went on a demonstration with my wife about a week after the vaccine passports were implemented. And there were at most 2,000 people in that demonstration in a city of 1.5 million. People tend to go along with what is asked of them. We are obedient, we are compliant as a collective. This is what allows us to have societies. It's what allows us to have governments, nations. And if people didn't conform and people didn't comply with basic rules, then you would have failed states. So I mean, like this is a fundamentally important thing. In any democratic country, you need to have compliance on the part of the public. But this is where I think I stress in my book, this needs to be based on the idea of consent of the governed. People in a democratic nation have the power to say enough is enough, to say that this is wrong, this is a red line that you have crossed. And we've done this many times before in the past. You could argue that the vote in the UK in favor of Brexit was an example of this. Governments have massively overreached. Unfortunately, in most countries, the response from the public has been largely docile.
Can there be benefits for digital ID, or is digital ID, in your opinion, just a problem anyway, in every way? That's the first question.
I think most of the benefits end up being for the, I would say, government and corporations. Like, let's say, for example, the European Union. Brussels right now is in the process of launching a digital identity wallet. And they are going to be pushing it very, very hard. They are able to sell this as an idea that, you know, you will have just about everything you need online, as well as access to many things that you might need for your kind of like offline world. And you will be able to use this wallet wherever you go in Europe. If you need to hire a car, let's say you live in Spain, you're going to Germany, you need to hire a car in Germany. it will make the process easier because it will be easier to validate your identity and all of these things. And you will have all of the idea is you'll have all you need in one pack, everything related to your identity in one place. The problem is, number one, I mean, if I were to go down what the problems I have with this, we could be here for a while, but I'll try and do it as quickly as I can. So number one, security. Okay, so number one is how secure will that data be? One person I quote in the book who worked in GCHQ on the IT side, he said that the problem, if you centralize all this data, you are basically creating a perfect honeypot for hackers to come along and to infiltrate and to get your information. Second thing is it's likely to include your biometric data. That is something we're seeing more and more of. Most of the digital identity programs that I have analyzed have involved some element of biometric data. That is your most valuable personal data that you can have. If that gets infiltrated, then you are going to lose data you cannot change. So it's not like losing a bank card. It's not like forgetting a password. This is basically, once that information is compromised, then you can't change it. So I mean, that is a fundamental issue as well. A recent article in the Toronto Sun in Canada that quoted, I think her name is Anne Karuvikan. I'm not absolutely sure. Kavorikan, I think it is. She was the digital commissioner for the territory of Ontario in Canada for 3 terms. So she served for many, many years in this role. She's had other roles of serious import. She said in this article that she would not want to have a digital identity. So she's been working in this area for decades, and she's a highly respected figure. She said she wouldn't want to have digital identity because she would not be able to guarantee that that information will be secure.
I suppose there is an argument. If you have digital information, it can be processed much more quickly. So for instance, health records, if it's kept within the context of data processing by the actual health administrator, specifically in your area for your health, it can be called up quickly and it can be addressed. Where the questions come in a lot more, it seems, are around the civil liberties and questions of your rights, in terms of, are they going to be utilized in terms of control or suffocating any of those freedoms in terms of movement, and questions that you go on to talk about in the new social contract and movement of people, and also in terms of digital currencies, which is also something that's very big that people are thinking about.
What you say is vital. I mean, like we've seen with the vaccine passports, especially in places like Italy, places like France, how they have been used to deny people access, how they have been used to exclude people. And I think that arguably one of the scariest things about vaccine passports, and by extension digital identity, is this potential to close off worlds for people who are not complying in all the ways that the authorities would like. The World Economic Forum, in a report called Identity in a Digital World, a new chapter in the social contract, they admit that digital identity will be used to open up or close off the digital world for individuals. And we've just seen right now in Nigeria, we've seen how the government in Nigeria has shut off mobile phone use. I mean, 73 million people in Nigeria, which is well over a third of the population, can no longer make outbound calls from their mobile phone because they do not have a digital identity.
Like you say, and like we've seen with the Canadian truckers, people that gave money towards them, they had their accounts seized. And you talk a lot about what's interesting as well in India that people may be aware of, but for 8 years there's been a project, 1.3 billion, that include biometrics, about getting everyone into digital ID, Adhaar. Do you want to talk a bit about how it's playing out just there, so we get an idea? Because in a way that's got duration and scale, right?
The Adhaar system is an interesting example. As you say, it's huge. It's the biggest identity program on the planet. It's I think it's 1.3 or maybe it's just less than 1.3 billion people who are on it. Something like 8 or 9% of the population are not on it. Those people are excluded from huge tracts of society, from the economy in many different ways. They are not able to receive government benefits. They are excluded, as I said, in many, many different ways. A lot of people would argue that Adhaar, the advantage of Adhaar has streamlined bureaucratic processes in India. It is helped to reduce the corruption that is inherent in local and kind of like regional national government in the country. Some people do see positives, some people do see negatives. I think that the scary thing is, like, you know, you've already had hacks of some of the data. So people have had their data compromised, and this raises serious questions. You know, if you were to have a larger hack, you know, when you have that much amount of data in one place, it does raise serious questions. So I mean, like India, I think India, one of the reasons India was a pioneer in this is because India has a very strong IT sector. So it had the kind of like technological nous to get much of this done, although it was assisted in certain ways by organizations, foreign organizations. And that is very much in contrast to many countries, for example, in Africa, which do not have the resources. So I mean, like in Africa, there are dozens of countries that are having digital identity programs set up, and they're almost exclusively being set up by foreign companies. And these are often companies in the military and intelligence and consulting sectors. So it's like, I think one argument that can be made is that this is almost like a continuation of a kind of like a colonialism. Certainly the French and the English governments are financing, or the British government is financing a lot of this in Africa.
When you look at somewhere like America, you've got the Constitution and the idea of freedom. Why do you think there's such disparities between somewhere like New York and somewhere like, you know, New York State and Florida and the different areas that you've seen? You know, you point out that you say that, you know, some of the democratic states have been the most draconian, but why do you think that's playing out that way?
I mean, like if you look at the democratic states, I mean, it makes sense that people who are left of center are more concerned with the idea of protecting everyone from what seemed like a very, very dangerous virus. I think that because of their kind of like the social conscious, the idea of the collective good, and then people on the right are more concerned with individual rights, liberties, and basically protecting the Constitution. So I mean, like, because in the US, everything is kind of like bipolar. You have two parties. You have this very divided country that is much more divided than it's been in a long time because of, I would say, what happened in 2016. The one good thing in the US, because of the very clear checks and balances that were built into the system by politicians who are clearly wiser than our current generation of politicians, I think it's been much harder to push through a kind of federalized system, a federal system of vaccine passports, even though they are trying. They're trying to do it in all sorts of ways.
What's your view as to why we've seen the different kind of things, particularly in places like, I mean, France, Spain, and Italy is really interesting. I mean, and then Canada and Australia.
I have my suspicions, but I don't have any way of proving them. But my suspicions is that Italy, because it's kind of like such an important country for the European Union, because it's become such a difficult, has always been a difficult country to govern. The fact that it has a central banker, a former central banker, former Goldman Sachs banker in the role of prime minister right now. I think that there is a clear desire on the part of the European authorities to ensure that Italy doesn't get out of control. It can't get out of control for the simple reason economically, it is a serious threat to the viability of the European Union, because it has, I think, like the debt to GDP ratio now is about 160%. They've used much more draconian policies there than they have in Spain. even though when you look at it, there's not actually been that much in the difference in the rate of vaccination uptake.
As you say, both the World Health Organization and the EU, they've done a deal with Deutsche Telekom. So that's to both for vaccine passports and also for other things they're saying, as you say, for digital ID. That has consequences, certainly even in Britain, where we've kicked back vaccine passports and we've stopped the mandate. Even if you don't have the things you've referenced already, which is the consultation on the digital ID for work and renting and other things, if we go abroad and we need to show those things, then they're all on a handset and all of that. It doesn't take a genius to realize that that's going to have an impact domestically as well.
One of the things that most concerns me is the fact the World Health Organization is looking to recommend vaccine passports at a global level. Now, if that was to happen, that would mean that vaccine passports would become a universal phenomenon and they would become a permanent phenomenon. T-Systems, which is the IT arm of Deutsche Telekom, which already helped to kind of like make the different vaccine passport systems in Europe interoperable. So it has lots of experience of doing this, is being asked to do the same at a global level. So I mean, it seems like that is the direction of travel. That should concern us massively. The World Health Organization has been saying since the vaccine passport question came up, we're not going to back these for a whole host of reasons. One, because they're going to exacerbate inequality. Poorer countries are going to suffer the consequences, et cetera, et cetera. And also, this is where it gets really interesting. We don't know how effective the vaccines are at containing transmission of this virus. Now, the irony is today we do know, and we know that they don't work very well. So, I mean, if the World Health Organization has decided to go in favor of vaccine passports at a time when clearly the vaccines themselves provide very little protection against transmission, then it does suggest that there's something else afoot. Number two, it's worth saying, and the World Health Organization doesn't have the power to enforce that. They have the power to recommend. That could change if the global pandemic treaty, which is kind of like being negotiated right now, if that does happen, if there is an agreement at a global level to give the World Health Organization much more teeth to enforcing policy, health policy on nations. If that happens, then yeah, we have a really big couple of things to worry about. And I don't think people are really aware of that, or most people are not aware of that. So I'd say that is something that certainly people should be watching, because that's happening at a global level. That is above the nation state level. And if it does end up that the World Health Organization does get these extra powers, these additional powers, including potentially the power to sanction governments that don't play along, then we're in a very different kind of world. And it's worth pointing out the World Health Organization, something like 80% of its funding comes from private companies and private foundations. It does bring into question where its loyalties actually lie.
I think people really would be interested to hear what you think about the digital currency. Is there a possibility of having digital currency without it being dominated by control? And can there be privacy and anonymity still with it? Or is there a way of doing it without just it being very draconian, is the question, I suppose.
In central bank digital currencies, this is another thing that I think most people are largely unaware of. It's something that over 100 countries are pursuing in one shape or form. Like, so there are only 3 central bank digital currencies that have so far been implemented, as far as I'm aware. One of which, ironically, is Nigeria. I don't think it's coincidental that we have this kind of drastic draconian legislation being used in Nigeria, barring 73 million people from using their mobile phones, at the same time as a central bank digital currency is being launched. And central banks around the world, like the IMF says, there are a lot of people who are playing a lot of interest in what's happening in Nigeria, including lots of central banks. we're looking at over 100 central banks, I think it is, that are paying an interest in this. And they include the biggest on the planet. They include the Federal Reserve, they include the Bank of England, they include the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, basically all the central banks of all the G20 nations. So they represent 90% of the global economy. This is massive. This is hugely important. I wrote an article recently where I said that this is essentially represents a financial revolution, yet most people are unaware of it. It's a revolution that I believe will favor, obviously, the central banks. Central banks will go from being like a massive intermediary in the economy to being like the overwhelming force. It will put out of business, potentially it risks putting out of business a lot of banks, because you're going to have a situation where the central bank is going to be competing directly with the banks they regulate, which is unheard of as far as I'm aware. I mean, like, it's very rare to have a regulator go into direct competition with the companies it regulates. So as well as having a bank account with Barclays Bank or with HSBC or whatever, each person in the UK will be able to have, if the so-called Bitcoin takes place, each person will have an account with the Bank of England. Now, what this means is that if you go through a financial crisis like 2008, where people begin to worry about how safe their money is in their bank, and the UK saw bank runs with Northern Rock, they saw many other institutions begin to have serious problems. So if you begin to have worries about just how safe the money is in the commercial bank, people will very easily just take their money out and move it to their central bank account. So that raises serious questions about the stability of the banking system. And I think more importantly, you asked me just whether or not these kinds of technologies can be used in a good way. I think that it depends on who the actors are. So we have to ask ourselves how good a job central banks have done over the last 20, 30, 40 years governing the monetary situation of each economy. And I think there are quite a few people out there and quite a few economists who would argue that central banks have played a fundamental role in exacerbating wealth and income inequality by constantly bailing out the banks that end up getting in trouble, by constantly bailing out. In the last crisis we had with the pandemic, with the arrival of the pandemic, the central banks around the world bailed out just about everybody. And when I say they bailed out just about everybody, they bailed out just about everybody that had a lot of wealth. They helped to engender another bubble in most of the assets that are held by those who have large amounts of money. So it's pretty clear that their interest is not, I would say, the general public's interest. So I mean, that is a very serious concern if we're about to give these institutions unprecedented amounts of power and control over the economy.
What do you think now, in terms of how you see things, where we are now, you would say about the role that citizens and others can play within all of this?
We're going through a very, very serious economic crisis. We are facing inflation levels we've not seen since the 1970s. And at the same time, I live in a country where there's 13% unemployment, and we're likely to see stagflation come in the next few months. That means that unemployment is likely to go up at the same time that prices are going up. That's a hard time for people just to kind of like get by on a day-to-day basis. I think number one, we need an informed citizenry. We need people to know what's going on. And this is really hard given the amount of bad information that's out there. I'm not going to use the word misinformation or disinformation. I'm just going to say bad information. And there's a lot of it about. And some of the worst purveyors, I would say, have got the biggest voices in the mainstream. This is seriously problematic. if people are not informed about what is happening, there's no way that kind of the population, societies, is much more difficult for them to take the right path, and to hold their elected representatives to account. I think that the UK has done a reasonably good job in holding the government to account, at least regarding vaccine passports, as you said, vaccine mandates. I think that certainly there's been much more of a pushback than in some other countries. So I think that that should be a sign for optimism, in my view. And like I said in the book, I think the US is going to be possibly the place where the last stand will take place, because you have a large part of the political community who are opposed to the vaccine passports. So it's, I think that in most places in Europe, opposition to digital identity and vaccine passports, unfortunately, in the political institutions, is relatively insignificant. We need to keep people aware. I mean, like organizations like your own are doing a fantastic job. The Stop Commons Pass is doing a fantastic job. Big Brother Watch is doing a fantastic job. It's holding the feet of power to the fire, which is important. It's essential, it's basic, especially when those in power are trying to use whatever means possible to expand the power they have. For me, what digital identity represents is a massive diminishment in the amount of not just privacy and freedom we have as citizens, but also the amount of power we have as a collective. And I think this is why it is fundamental. It falls upon us to push back, because we are the ones that are kind of like a model, I would argue, for other countries. I'm not saying we are perfect by any means. We're not a great model, but we're a much better model than most other countries.
I think it's a very, very important point. It's a great one to finish off on, that we're the custodians of, and many people have fought and died for freedom and democracy and rights. And you rightly talk about a lot of that in this book. So we really encourage people to get it. You can do it with us as well. We're going to be doing a special deal together for the book. You'll be able to see it. And we hope to be hearing and reading more from you, Nick. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thanks for the work, the contribution. And we hope we can talk to you again in the future.
Me too. I mean, thanks for having me on. It would be a pleasure to chat again.